So on your feet, boy. We don't let trash sleep on Bull Street. Officer Brad Keller kicked the cardboard out from under the sleeping man, sent a half-empty water bottle skidding into the gutter, and grabbed a fistful of the old veteran's collar. He yanked hard enough that the gray-haired black man's knees scraped raw against the concrete. "You hear me, you deaf and homeless." Keller sneered, dragging him toward the curb while a crowd of strangers stood frozen coffee going cold in their hands. "Look at you. Big black nobody stinking up my sidewalk. You're garbage and garbage goes in the can." The old man tried to rise with whatever dignity he had left, and that only made Keller laugh. "Aw, what's this? You think you're somebody?" He shoved him back down with a boot to the shoulder. "You're a staying old man. People like you are why this neighborhood's going to hell." The veteran's lip was bleeding now. He still said nothing. So Keller leaned in close enough to spit the words into his ear. "Nobody's coming for you. No family, no home, no name worth knowing. You'll die under a bridge, and the whole city will thank me for hauling you off like the trash you are." The old man didn't fight back. He couldn't. He only reached desperately, fingers trembling for something that had tumbled out of his worn canvas bag. A small gold star on a faded blue ribbon rolling across the pavement where nobody bothered to look. 3 hours later, in a quiet courtroom downtown, a judge opened a thin manila file, read 4 lines, and stopped breathing. His pen slipped from his hand. The room fell silent. Because the man they called trash was about to become the most decorated person any of them had ever stood beside. Now, before we go further, don't you dare leave early, because the moment that judge realizes who this man really is will give you chills. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. I read every single one. And if you believe a person's worth was never about what they wear or the color of their skin, hit subscribe and stay with me to the very end. What's going on, everybody? The road doesn't care where you came from, only that you showed up willing to listen. So let's go listen. The morning before all of that, the sun came up gray and soft over the Truman Parkway overpass, and Elijah Carter was already awake. He had been awake since 4:50, the way he'd woken up for 30 years, his body refusing to forget a schedule the rest of his life had abandoned. He lay still for a moment on his folded sleeping bag, listening to the hum of early traffic above him, to the river of wind moving through the concrete pillars, to the soft snoring of the only family he had left. Scout was curled against his side. A medium mutt part, shepherd part, something nobody could name, with one torn ear and eyes that watched Elijah like he was the last warm thing in the world. Elijah rested a hand on the dog's ribs and felt them rise and fall. "All right," he murmured. "All right. Up we go." He sat up. His back protested. 55 years old, and he had the joints of a man much older, the kind of body that carried things heavier than years. He reached for the small duffel bag that never left his side and unzipped it just enough to check the way he checked every morning that everything was still there. Then he zipped it shut again without taking anything out, some things you carried without ever looking at them. He folded his sleeping bag into a perfect square, corners sharp, edges aligned. A man passing by once asked him why a homeless man bothered making his bed under a bridge, and Elijah had only said, "Because nobody can take that from me." The man hadn't understood. Elijah didn't expect him to. He cracked open a bottle of cold water, poured a little into a dented metal cup for Scout, and used the rest with a sliver of soap to shave. No mirror. He didn't need one. His hands knew the shape of his own face the way they'd once known how to find a vein in the dark, in the rain, with a man screaming and the world on fire around him. That was a different life. He didn't let himself live there anymore. By the time the city fully woke, Elijah had his boots laced, his coat buttoned, and Scout's leash, a length of old climbing rope, looped around his wrist. He walked the 8 blocks to Gloria's, a corner diner with a cracked front window and the best biscuits in Savannah, owned by a heavyset man named Frank Delgado, who had never once treated Elijah like a problem to be solved. Disgusted Frank called from behind the counter, because that's what everyone who knew Elijah called him, though few of them knew why. "You're early." "Habit," Elijah said. Frank slid a paper plate across the counter, 2 biscuits, a scoop of gravy, and a sausage patty cut in half. "Dishes are stacked to the ceiling back there. You wash, you eat." "Same deal." "Same deal." Elijah dipped his head. "Appreciate you, Frank. Oh, don't get sentimental on me before 7 a.m. But Frank smiled when he said it, and he set down a bowl of water and a scrap of sausage for Scout without being asked. Elijah ate standing in the back by the sink, quietly, neatly, the way he did everything. He saved half a biscuit and slipped it into his pocket for later. Then he rolled up his sleeves and went to work on the dishes, his hands moving with the same steady economy they'd always had. Frank watched him from the register and shook his head, not in pity, but in something closer to respect. He'd known the man 2 years and still couldn't square it, how somebody so squared away, so polite, so capable, had ended up sleeping under a bridge. He'd asked once. Elijah had given him almost nothing. What Frank didn't know, what nobody in Savannah knew, was the shape of the years that had broken Elijah Carter down to this. The 2 tours. The 3rd one that ended with him being carried out on a stretcher and waking up in a hospital in Germany. The medals he'd never hung on a wall because he didn't think he deserved to keep breathing while better men didn't. The wife Diane, who'd waited and finally couldn't wait anymore. The daughter who stopped calling. The VA paperwork that vanished into a system that lost him as thoroughly as the war had. The nights when the noises in his head got so loud that 4 walls felt like a coffin, and the only place he could breathe was outside under the open sky where he could see everything coming. PTSD, the discharge papers called it. As if a word could hold all that. So he stopped fighting the current. He let the city forget him. And he had made a kind of peace with it, a quiet, threadbare peace built around a dog, a diner, and a duffel bag he never opened. He was nearly done with the dishes when the bell over the door chimed, and a man in a pressed golf shirt walked in, the kind of man who wore his money like a uniform. He took one look at Elijah through the kitchen pass-through, at the worn coat, the gray stubble the dog tied up just outside the door, and his face curdled. "Frank," the man said, loud enough to carry. "You letting them wash the dishes now people still eat here?" Frank's jaw tightened. Elijah didn't turn around. He just kept his hands in the warm water, kept scrubbing, kept breathing slow. But something in the room had shifted. A coldness. The kind he'd learned to feel before he could name it. And Elijah Carter, who had survived 3 tours and a war that never fully let him go, had no way of knowing that the worst day of his civilian life was about to begin over a plate of biscuits and the color of his skin. The man in the golf shirt didn't sit down. He stood near the register with his arms crossed, performing his disgust for the whole diner. "I'm serious, Frank. I come here to eat, not to watch some bum handle the plates I'm gonna eat off of." He wrinkled his nose. "You can smell him from here. This is a health thing. I could report you." Frank set down the coffee pot with a hard clack. "His name's Elijah. He's cleaner than half the people who walk through that door, and he works for his food, which is more than I can say for some. You want breakfast? Sit down. You want to run your mouth? The door's right there." A few regulars glanced up from their tables, uncomfortable eyes flicking between the 2 men. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever did. Elijah dried his hands on a towel and stepped out from the back. He didn't want Frank catching trouble over him. It's all right, he said quietly. I'm done here anyway, Frank. I'll head out. You don't have to go anywhere, Doc. I know. Elijah offered a small, tired smile. But I'd rather walk than be the reason your morning goes sideways. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The man in the golf shirt followed Elijah's movements with narrowed eyes, then pulled out his phone. He stepped toward the window theatrically and dialed. Yes, hello. I'd like to report a vagrant, he said loud, making sure everyone heard. Corner of Habersham and Jones. He's harassing customers at a restaurant, refusing to leave, real aggressive. There's a big black guy. Gray hair, got a dog. Looks like he's on something. Yeah. Please hurry. Frank's face went red. Are you kidding me? He's leaving. He didn't touch you. Just being a concerned citizen, the man said, sliding his phone back into his pocket with a smug little smile. Elijah said nothing. He'd already started for the door, scout's rope in his hand. He knew how this went. He'd learned over years on the street that the safest thing a man like him could do was become invisible, be gone before the trouble arrived. He made it out onto the sidewalk and started walking south, head down, shoulders square, doing nothing wrong at all. He got 2 blocks. The patrol car pulled to the curb, fast tires scraping, and Officer Brad Keller climbed out before it had fully stopped. 28 years old, built like he never let you forget it, with the restless energy of a man looking for a reason. He'd been on the force 6 years, and had 3 excessive force complaints filed against him, all of them quietly buried. Hey, you stop right there. Keller's hand was already resting on his belt. Elijah stopped. He turned slowly, kept his hands visible, kept his voice low and even. Morning, officer. I'm just walking. I'm not looking for any trouble. Got a call, says you were harassing folks back at that diner. No, sir. I was washing dishes for my breakfast. The owner can tell you. I left when a customer got upset. I didn't want any problems. Keller looked him up and down the coat, the bag, the dog, the skin, and decided what he'd already decided before he got out of the car. Yeah, you got ID, I do. Elijah moved his hand slowly toward his coat. It's right here in my... Did I tell you to reach? Don't reach. Keller's voice spiked, sharp and aggressive, a man manufacturing a crisis. Keep your hands where I can see them. Officer, you asked me for, then don't talk back to me. Keller stepped in close, crowding him. Scout let out a low, uncertain whine and pressed against Elijah's leg. And shut that mutt up. He's fine. He won't bother you. Elijah's voice stayed maddeningly calm, the calm of a man who had learned a long time ago that panic gets people killed. Sir, I'd like to understand what I'm being detained for. You're being detained because I said so. Keller's hand shot out and grabbed Elijah's duffel bag by the strap, yanking it half off his shoulder. What have you got in here, huh? Drugs, stolen stuff. Please, please don't. For the first time, something cracked in Elijah's composure. His hand went toward the bag. That bag is everything I have. Please be careful with it. So get your hands off it. Keller wrenched the strap, and the bag's worn zipper split. He shoved Elijah's chest with his forearm hard, and Elijah stumbled back a step. By now, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. A young man in a hoodie had his phone up filming. An older woman had her hand over her mouth. Frank had come running from the diner 2 blocks back, shouting something nobody could hear yet. Officer, Elijah said, and his voice was steady again, though his hands had begun to tremble at his sides, not from fear of Keller, but from the old, deep tremor that came when the world got too loud, too fast, too much like before. I am not resisting. I am cooperating. I am asking you to please slow down. You don't get to ask me for anything, Keller spat. He reached for his cuffs, and the whole sidewalk went still, every phone rising, every breath held as a 6-year veteran with a chip on his shoulder, prepared to put a man in handcuffs for the crime of being poor, being tired, and being black on the wrong block in the wrong morning. What none of them knew, not Keller, not the crowd, not even Frank, was what was inside that torn canvas bag. It happened fast. The way these things always do. Keller grabbed Elijah's wrist and twisted it up behind his back harder than he needed to, and Elijah grunted, but didn't pull away. Stop resisting. Keller barked loud, performative for the cameras he hadn't even noticed yet. Elijah wasn't resisting. That was the thing that made the crowd start to murmur. He was standing completely still. "Sir, I'm not fighting you," Elijah said, his voice tight with the strain of the wrenched arm. "I'm not down, on the ground, now." Keller swept a boot behind Elijah's knee and shoved, and the older man went down hard onto the concrete palms, scraping the duffel bag spilling open beneath him. And that's when it happened. Things tumbled out across the sidewalk. A folded triangle of cloth, an American flag, the kind they hand to a family at a funeral, except this one had been given to Elijah himself for living when others didn't. A small leather case, a faded photograph of a young woman holding a baby, and a flash of gold on a faded blue ribbon rolling, catching the gray morning light. Coming to rest near the gutter, Elijah forgot about the pain in his arm. He forgot about Keller's knee in his back. He reached desperately, fingers stretching across the dirty concrete for the flag. "Please," he said, and his voice broke on the word in a way it hadn't broken once all morning. "Please, don't let that touch the ground. Please, that flag, please, stop reaching." Keller drove a knee harder into his spine and grabbed his collar, hauling him sideways away from the scattered things. And then, leaning down where the cameras could catch it, where the crowd could hear it, he said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "On your feet. We don't let trash sleep on Bull Street." A sound went through the crowd, a collective intake of breath, an audible flinch. Did he just... He's not even fighting. That man's reaching for an American flag. The young man with the phone stepped closer, narrating low and shaky. "Y'all are seeing this. This man is on the ground, he ain't resisting, and this cop is calling him trash. This is Savannah, Georgia, right now." An older man near the back, gray ponytail, faded leather vest with a unit patch, a veteran himself, pushed forward. "Officer, that's a service flag. You see those medals on the ground? That man served. What in God's name are you doing? Step back, sir, or you're next." Keller snapped, not even looking. He cuffed Elijah's wrists behind his back, ratcheting them too tight. Elijah didn't cry out. He'd been hurt worse in worse places by worse things. But a single tear cut down through the dust on his cheek, not for the pain, but for the flag lying in the gutter and the gold star spinning to a stop in the dirt. Scout had gone wild. The dog strained against the climbing rope leash, which Elijah had dropped, barking and snapping, trying to put his body between Keller and his only person. "Easy, Scout," Elijah managed, twisting to find the dog with his eyes. "Easy, boy. Stay, stay." And the dog, trembling, obeyed, sitting, whining, watching, because the one thing in the world he trusted had told him to. Frank arrived then, out of breath, furious. "Get off him. He works for me. He didn't do anything. I'll testify, you hear me. I saw the whole thing start. That man in there lied." He pointed back toward the diner where the golf shirt man had wisely already disappeared. "Everybody back up!" Keller shouted, hauling Elijah to his feet by the cuffs, wrenching his shoulders. "Show's over." The veteran in the vest knelt, and with shaking hands, gathered the flag from the gutter. He folded the loose corner back into its triangle, holding it against his chest, like something holy. He picked up the gold star on its ribbon, turned it over once in his palm, and went very still. He'd seen one of these before. Once, in a photograph in a museum behind glass. "My God," he whispered. "Do you people have any idea what this is?" Nobody answered him. Keller was already steering Elijah toward the patrol car. "What about my dog?" Elijah said suddenly, panic rising for the first time, not for himself, never for himself. "Officer, please, my dog. He's got nobody but me. Please don't let him run into traffic, please." "Not my problem," Keller said, and pushed his head down to fold him into the back seat. "Yeah, I'll take him," Frank called out, rushing to grab the rope leash. Doc, I got him. I'll keep him at the diner, you hear me? I got Scout. You just hold on." Through the window of the patrol car, Elijah found Frank's eyes and the dog's, and he nodded once, a small broken nod of thanks as the door slammed shut. The crowd stood in the street, 20 phones still recording, as the patrol car pulled away from the curb. Scout lunged after it to the end of the rope, barking, then howling a sound that made grown men look at the ground. The veteran in the vest stood holding a folded flag and a Medal of Honor. He didn't yet know the full weight of watching the taillights shrink down Bull Street. "That man?" He said to no one, and everyone is somebody. "I'd stake my life on it." He had no idea how right he was. None of them did. But in a few short hours, a judge in a quiet courtroom would open a thin manila file, and the whole city would learn exactly who they'd thrown in the back of that car. The Chatham County Jail processed Elijah Carter the way a machine processes scrap efficiently, indifferently, without ever once looking him in the eye. They took his coat. They took his belt and his bootlaces. They took the duffel bag, logging its contents on a clipboard in a board hand 1-1 folded flag. 1-1 photograph. 1-1 leather case medals. The word medals was written small, an afterthought, the way you'd note a man was carrying loose change. "Empty your pockets," the booking officer said. Elijah set down half a biscuit wrapped in a napkin. The officer looked at it, looked at him, and threw it in the trash. Elijah watched it go and said nothing. He'd learned a long time ago that grief over small things was a luxury the powerless couldn't afford. They printed him, photographed him against a height chart, the numbers framing his tired face. They asked his name, and he gave it. They asked his address, and he said quietly, "I don't have one right now." The officer typed transient and moved on. In a holding cell that smelled of bleach and despair, Elijah sat on a steel bench with his back against the cinder block and closed his eyes. He did the thing he always did when the walls pressed in. He breathed. 4 counts in. Hold. 4 counts out. He pictured the river, the wide brown water moving slow under the bridge, Scout dozing in a patch of sun. He pictured anything but the 4 close walls and the locked door and the hours stretching ahead. Meanwhile, 2 floors up, Officer Brad Keller was writing his report. He sat at a scarred desk with a vending machine coffee and built a story out of nothing. Subject was highly agitated and verbally aggressive, he typed. Subject refused lawful commands. When this officer attempted to detain subject, pulled away and swung a closed fist, striking this officer in the chest. Subject was taken to the ground for officer safety. Subject continued to resist. He read it back satisfied. It was clean. It was the kind of report that had carried him through 3 complaints already. Who were they going to believe, a decorated officer of the law or a homeless drug addict with no fixed address and a rap sheet they'd surely dig up if they looked hard enough? He charged Elijah with resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and assault on a law enforcement officer, the last one a felony. He smiled a little, typing it. That one would stick. That one would put the old man away for a good long while somewhere off his sidewalk for good. What Keller didn't account for was 20 phones. By noon, the video was already moving. A clip 11 seconds shaky vertical showed Elijah on the ground, not moving, reaching for a flag, and Keller's voice ringing out clear as a bell, "We don't let trash sleep on Bull Street." It had 4,000 views. By 2 o'clock, 40,000. The comments were a wall of fury. But the system didn't move at the speed of the internet. The system moved at the speed of paperwork, and the paperwork said Elijah Carter was an aggressor. The public defender assigned to him arrived at 3:40 that afternoon, harried and overworked a thick stack of folders under one arm. Her name was Rachel Quinn. 29 years old, 3 years out of law school, carrying a caseload that would crush a person twice her age. She'd been handed 41 cases that month. Elijah's was just one more manila folder in a tower of them. She sat across from him in the cramped interview room and opened the file without really looking up. "Mr. Carter, I'm Rachel Quinn. I've been appointed to represent you. I'll be honest with you because I don't have time not to be. You're charged with felony assault on an officer. The officer's report says you struck him. With charges like these, the smart move is usually to take a plea. They'll likely offer time served plus probation. You walk out, you put this behind you. I can try to negotiate that today." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. Calm, steady. Those dark, tired eyes that seemed to see straight through the noise to the thing underneath. "I didn't lay a hand on him, ma'am," he said simply. Rachel kept reading her notes. "I understand, but the report is wrong. They're all wrong, Mr. Carter. That's not—" She stopped herself, rubbed her eyes. "Look, I believe you might believe that. But it's your word against a police officer's, and you don't exactly have—" She gestured vaguely at the file, at his circumstances, at the whole impossible situation. "It's a hard case to win. A plea protects you. I won't say I did something I didn't do." His voice never rose. It didn't need to. "I've spent my whole life standing behind the truth. I'm not going to lie about it now just because it's easier. With respect, ma'am, I'd rather lose honest than win false." Rachel finally looked up. Really looked for the first time. There was something in the way he held himself, even here, even in a jumpsuit with his shoulders aching from cuffs pulled too tight. He sat the way her grandfather used to sit, a Korea man, straight-backed, hands folded, present. And the phrase he'd just used. "I'd rather lose honest than win false." That wasn't street talk. That wasn't a desperate man saying anything to get out. That was a man with a code. "Mr. Carter," she said slowly, setting down her pen. "Can I ask you something? Where did you serve?" For just a flicker, something crossed his face, surprise, then a door closing. "Long time ago," he said. "It's not in the file." "Why not?" He didn't answer. He just looked at his folded hands. And Rachel Quinn, exhausted and overworked, and one folder away from going home, felt the small electric prickle a good lawyer learns to trust, the sense that the thin file in front of her was hiding something much, much bigger than the charges printed on its cover. "All right," she said quietly, gathering her things. "Don't take any plea. Don't talk to anyone. Let me make a few calls." She had no idea those calls were about to change everything. That evening, while Rachel Quinn sat at her kitchen table chasing dead-end phone numbers, Officer Brad Keller was at a sports bar 2 blocks from the precinct holding court. "You should have seen this guy." He laughed, beer in hand, 3 other officers around the table. "Big old bum, smelled like a dumpster. Swung on me right there on the sidewalk. I put him down quick." He took a swallow. "Don't worry about the video. People love filming half a thing. By the time it gets to court, it's my word, and my word's gold. One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably. I don't know, man. That clip's everywhere. My sister sent it to me. The guy's not even moving in it. Cameras lie, Keller said flatly. I was there. Trust me, the system protects its own. He raised his glass. Always has. He was so confident that the next morning he did something stupid. He drove down to the jail before his shift, talked his way back to the holding area, and stood outside Elijah's cell. Hey, he said. Trash. Listen close. You're gonna plead out, you're gonna disappear, and you're gonna stay off my streets. Because if this goes to trial, I'll bury you. You think anybody's gonna take your word over mine, you're nobody. You're nothing. You got no people, no name, no nothing. Elijah looked up at him from the bench. He didn't stand. He didn't flinch. He just held Keller's eyes with a stillness that for one strange second made the younger man uneasy. Son, Elijah said quietly, I've stood across from men who wanted to kill me. Men with rifles. You don't scare me. You're just loud. He looked back down at his hands. Go on now. You've got a shift. Keller's jaw worked. He wanted a reaction and got nothing. He left more rattled than he'd admit. Across town, Rachel Quinn was making progress. She'd pulled Elijah's intake sheet and found his full legal name and date of birth. On a hunch that code, that bearing I'd rather lose honest than win false, she called a contact. At the County Veterans Affairs office, a clerk named Maya Brooks, who owed her a favor. Maya, I need you to run a name through the service database. Elijah Carter, DOB 314-1970. She read it off. I think this man's a vet, and I think it matters. She heard Maya's keyboard clicking. Then it stopped. Then there was a silence on the line that went on a beat too long. Rachel, Maya said slowly, where is this man right now? Chatham County Jail. Why? Because his record's flagged. Most of it's sealed. I can see he served. I can see 3 combat deployments. I can see a medical retirement, but the citation file, the awards, it's restricted access. I can't open it from my terminal. A pause. Rachel, you don't seal a man's file for nothing. The ones that get sealed like this, they're the big ones. The ones that go up the chain. I've only seen a handful in 12 years. Rachel's heart was pounding. Can you get it unsealed? Not me. But a sitting judge can request it for a court proceeding. If his case is going to trial, the court can subpoena the full military record. It'll come straight from the Department of the Army. Maya lowered her voice. Rachel, push for that. Whatever's in that sealed file, I have a feeling it changes the whole picture. That same night, 2 more pieces fell into place. Frank Delgado tracked down Rachel's office number and left a message he'd been there. He'd seen the man in the golf shirt lie to the dispatcher, and he'd testify to it under oath. And the veteran in the leather vest. His name was Hank Mosley, Vietnam. 2 tours had found the diner. Frank found Scout sleeping behind the counter and handed Frank a phone full of his own footage from a better angle. Footage that showed clear as day Elijah standing still with his hands visible the entire time. That man never raised a hand. Hank told Frank, his voice rough. I watched the whole thing, and I'll tell you something else. He'd held up his phone showing a zoomed photo of the gold star he'd picked up off the pavement. I served with a guy who got one of these. There were maybe a few dozen living men in this whole country who can wear this. That cop dragged one of them down the street and called him garbage. By morning, Rachel had assembled it all: Frank's statement, Hank's clean footage, the viral clip, and most importantly, Maya's discovery of a sealed military record. She filed an emergency motion with the court requesting that Elijah's full service record be subpoenaed and unsealed for the proceedings, arguing it went directly to her client's character and credibility. The judge assigned to the case was a careful, fair-minded man with 30 years on the bench, known for reading every file front to back before he ever entered the courtroom. His name was Robert Hale, and when the court clerk, Maya Brooks herself, walked the freshly arrived sealed file into his chambers the morning of the hearing, she set it on his desk with hands that trembled slightly. "Your Honor," she said, "the Army sent this over for the Carter matter. It came priority flagged for your eyes." She hesitated at the door. I think you should sit down before you open it." Judge Hale glanced up half amused. "Maya, I've read 10,000 files." "Not like this one, Your Honor," she said quietly and slipped out, leaving him alone with a thin manila folder that was about to stop his heart. The courtroom on the second floor of the Chatham County Courthouse was fuller than anyone expected for a misdemeanor and felony arraignment. Word had traveled. The viral clip had passed 1 million views overnight, and the gallery was packed. Reporters, veterans in old uniforms, ordinary citizens who'd watched an 11-second video and couldn't stop thinking about it. Hank Mosley sat in the second row in his leather vest, back straight. Frank Delgado sat beside him, having left the diner closed for the morning. A sign on the door that simply read, "Family Emergency." In a sense, it was. Elijah Carter was led in, wearing a jail jumpsuit, his wrists cuffed in front of him, now his gray hair combed flat with water. He found Frank and Hank in the crowd and gave them the smallest nod. Then he sat beside Rachel Quinn at the defense table, folded his cuffed hands, and waited with the patience of a man who had waited through worse. At the prosecution table, the assistant district attorney shuffled papers, and behind him, confident in a fresh-pressed uniform, sat Officer Brad Keller, one ankle crossed over his knee, certain this would be over in 20 minutes. "All rise." Judge Robert Hale entered. He was a tall, spare man in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the unhurried gravity of someone who had spent his life weighing other people's. But those who knew him well might have noticed something off this morning, a tightness around his eyes, a paper-pale cast to his face. He carried a thin manila folder in his hand, and he set it down on the bench in front of him with a strange, deliberate care, the way a man sets down something fragile. "Be seated." The room sat. The prosecutor stood and ran through it briskly. The charges: resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, felony assault on a law enforcement officer. The state would show that the defendant, a transient, became aggressive and struck Officer Keller, requiring him to be subdued. And the state intends to call Officer Keller, whose testimony and report established the assault. "Very well," Judge Hale said. His voice was quiet. "Before we proceed, the court has received and reviewed a document subpoenaed at the defense's request. The defendant's complete military service record transmitted directly from the Department of the Army." He paused. "I'd ask counsel for both sides to approach for a moment." Rachel rose, surprised. The prosecutor frowned and stood. They came to the bench. Judge Hale opened the manila folder. He looked down at the first page for a long moment. The courtroom couldn't hear what was on it, but they could see the judge's face, and they watched in real time as the color drained out of it. He read the first 4 lines. His pen, which he'd been holding, slipped from his fingers and rolled across the bench. He didn't reach for it. "Counsel," he said very low, so only Rachel and the prosecutor could hear, "do either of you know the contents of this file?" "No, Your Honor," Rachel said. "It came sealed. We requested it, but haven't seen it." The judge's eyes moved across the page again, as if checking he'd read it correctly. As if he didn't trust his own eyes. He turned to the second page. There was a name on it, a date, a place, a province in Afghanistan that meant nothing to anyone in that room. Nothing except to him. Robert Hale's hands began very slightly to shake. Because on the second page in the official clinical language of a military citation was an account of a single day in a valley 11 years ago. And in that account, listed among the 4 wounded soldiers, a combat medic had dragged from a burning vehicle under enemy fire, refusing to leave a single one. Taking 2 rounds himself and still going back was a name the judge knew better than his own. First Lieutenant Daniel R. Hale, his son. The judge looked up slowly from the file. He looked past the lawyers, past the prosecutor's confused expression across the courtroom, to the defense table, to the gray-haired black man in the orange jumpsuit, sitting with his cuffed hands folded, calm and quiet, the man they'd dragged down Bull Street and called trash. "Counsel," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "Step back, please." They returned to their tables. The room had gone very still, sensing that something enormous was happening that none of them yet understood. Judge Hale set both hands flat on the bench as if to steady himself. He looked at the defendant for a long, long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the silent room, and it shook. "My Mr. Carter, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly." He swallowed. "On the 14th of June, 2013, in the Arghandab Valley, were you the medic who pulled 4 men out of a burning striker?" The courtroom held its breath. Elijah Carter lifted his head. Something moved behind his tired eyes, a door he'd kept shut for 11 years, easing open. He looked at the judge, and recognition dawned slowly on his face, an old grief and an old pride rising together. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I was." A sound went through the gallery, a gasp, a murmur, the rustle of 100 people leaning forward. "And the last man you carried out?" Judge Hale said, his voice breaking now openly in front of the whole court. "The one you went back for when the fuel line was already burning. Do you remember his name?" Elijah's eyes glistened. "Lieutenant Hale, sir," he said. "Young fella. Kept asking me about his mother's garden the whole way out so he wouldn't pass out. I told him to keep talking, so he'd stay with me." His voice cracked. "I never did find out if he made it." The judge gripped the edge of the bench, and a tear ran openly down his face, and the entire courtroom realized at the exact same moment what was happening. "He made it," Robert Hale whispered. "Mr. Carter, he made it. He's my son." The room erupted, and Officer Brad Keller, in his fresh-pressed uniform, felt the floor drop out from under him. Judge Hale brought down his gavel once, twice, until the noise in the gallery settled into a charged, breathless quiet. "Order, please." He wiped his face with the back of his hand, made no apology for it, and gathered himself. When a man has spent 30 years keeping his emotions off the bench, the courtroom understands that the day he stops is a day worth remembering. "Let the record reflect," he said, his voice steadying into something formal and clear, "that the court is going to read aloud portions of the defendant's service record because this courtroom and this city needs to hear them." He lifted the second page. He read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." He paused. Let the old weighty words land. "Sergeant First Class Elijah Carter, Combat Medic, United States Army, on the 14th of June, 2013, in the Arghandab Valley of Afghanistan. Sergeant Carter's convoy was struck by an improvised explosive device, disabling the lead vehicle and igniting its fuel system under heavy enemy fire." The room did not move. Nobody dared to breathe. Disregarding his own safety, Sergeant Carter advanced alone on foot across 40 meters of open ground under sustained fire to reach the burning vehicle. He extracted 1 wounded soldier and carried him to cover. He returned. He extracted a second. He returned again. Hale's voice tightened. Though struck twice by enemy fire, once in the shoulder, once in the thigh, Sergeant Carter refused evacuation and re-entered the burning vehicle a fourth time to recover the final trapped soldier, First Lieutenant Daniel Hale, moments before the fuel tank detonated. All 4 men survived. Sergeant Carter was the last to accept treatment. He set the page down with great care. For these actions, he said quietly, Sergeant First Class Elijah Carter was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration this nation can bestow. Presented at the White House. 2015. The silence broke into sound, a swell of it gasps and a sob somewhere in the back, and the scrape of people rising halfway out of their seats. Hank Mosley was already on his feet, his weathered hand pressed flat over his heart, tears running into his gray beard. And at the defense table, Elijah Carter bowed his head. Not in shame, in something heavier. The medal he'd never worn. The day he'd never spoken of. The 4 men he'd carried, and the dozens he hadn't been able to all the nights that Valley had followed him under that bridge. He had buried all of it inside a duffel bag he never opened, because to open it was to go back there. And now it was being read aloud in a room full of strangers. Mr. Carter, Judge Hale said gently. Why was your record sealed? Why does no one know who you are? Elijah lifted his head. When he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. And I asked them to seal it, sir, after I came home. He drew a slow breath. I didn't feel like a hero. Heroes don't get to feel like that. I came back and my wife had waited as long as a person can wait, and the man who came home wasn't the man she married. I couldn't sleep inside walls, couldn't hold a job with the noises in my head. The benefits got tangled up in paperwork and just stopped coming. And one day I looked up and I was on the street. He shook his head slowly. I didn't want a medal opening doors I hadn't earned the easy way. I figured if I couldn't stand on my own 2 feet, I had no business leaning on that star. So I put it away. I just wanted to be left alone. A long silence. Then Judge Hale turned slowly and fixed his eyes on Officer Brad Keller. Officer Keller, he said, and the warmth drained entirely out of his voice. Stand up. Keller stood. His confidence was gone, replaced by something pale and trembling. The fresh-pressed uniform suddenly looked like a costume on him. Your report states that this man swung a closed fist and struck you in the chest, requiring you to take him to the ground. Hale's voice was glacial. Is that your testimony under oath in my courtroom? Knowing what we now know, I'll give you one chance to reconsider it. Keller's mouth opened. Nothing came out at first. Your Honor, at the time I believed. The defense has submitted video, Your Honor. Rachel Quinn was on her feet, her voice ringing. Multiple angles. May I play it for the court? You may. The footage filled the screen. Hank Mosley's clean, steady recording. The whole courtroom watched Elijah Carter stand motionless, hands visible, speaking calmly, never once raising an arm, watched Keller grab the duffel, shove him, sweep his leg, and drive him to the concrete. Watched a Medal of Honor spill into the gutter. Watched Keller lean down and heard on the tinny audio, clear and damning, we don't let trash sleep on Bull Street. The video ended. The screen went dark. Nobody in that room moved. That, Judge Hale said into the silence, is not resisting arrest. That is a man being assaulted, and the only assault committed on Bull Street that morning, officer, was committed by you. He let it sit. You wrote a false report. You swore to it. You used the color of a man's skin and the worn-out coat on his back to decide he was guilty, and then you wrote a story to make it true. Keller's knees seemed to buckle. He gripped the table. He couldn't breathe. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, rising slowly, his face ashen. "The state withdraws all charges against Mr. Carter, immediately, without condition." "So ordered," Hale said. "All charges dismissed with prejudice." He looked at Elijah, and his voice softened to almost nothing. "Mr. Carter, Sergeant Carter, on behalf of this court, this county, and a system that failed you in every possible way, I am so deeply sorry." But Hale wasn't finished. He turned back to Keller, and his eyes were hard as iron. "As for you, officer, this court is not done with you, not by a long way." "Officer Brad Keller." Judge Hale's voice rang through the courtroom like struck steel. "You are relieved of your authority in this room as of this moment. I am ordering the immediate referral of this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation, filing a false police report, perjury, and assault under color of law." The prosecutor was already nodding. "The state will pursue it fully, Your Honor." Furthermore, Hale continued, "I am directing that a formal complaint be opened with the Internal Affairs Division of the Savannah Police Department, and I will be personally forwarding the contents of these proceedings, including the video evidence, to the Chief of Police and the Civilian Review Board." He leaned forward. "You will not be hauling anyone off any sidewalk while this is pending. Surrender your service weapon and badge to the bailiff." A stunned hush. Then Keller, desperate, flailing, blurted, "Your Honor, I didn't know who he was." The words landed in the room like a match in dry grass. Judge Hale's gavel cracked down. "You didn't know who he was." He repeated it slowly, with a contempt that filled every corner of the gallery. "Officer, that is precisely the point. You should not have to read a man's Medal of Honor citation to refrain from dragging him down a street and calling him garbage. He should have been safe from you when he was nobody to you. Every man asleep under that bridge should be safe from you. The fact that this one happened to save my son's life does not make your conduct a tragedy. It makes it a tragedy that was visible. How many others weren't? Nobody breathed." Keller's face had gone gray. He unclipped his badge with shaking hands and set it with his weapon on the bailiff's outstretched palm, and the small metallic sound of it seemed to echo. "Get him out of my courtroom," Hale said quietly. They led Brad Keller out the side door, and he did not look like a man who would be wearing that uniform again. Then the judge did something no one expected. He rose from the bench. He stepped down off the platform, down onto the courtroom floor, leaving the symbol of his authority behind him, and he walked across the open space to the defense table. "Sergeant Carter," he said. "Would you stand, please, if you're able?" Elijah rose slowly, his cuffs already removed by the bailiff at the judge's nod. The two men stood facing each other, the judge in his black robe, the veteran in his orange jumpsuit, and for a moment neither one was either of those things. They were just two men bound forever by a single burning day in a valley on the other side of the world. "My son is alive," Judge Hale said, and his composure finally fully broke. "Daniel is 34 years old. He's an engineer now. He's married. I have a grandson, a little boy named after his grandfather, and that child exists because of what you did. For 11 years, I have wanted to find the man who carried my son out of that fire. The Army gave me a name and a sealed file and told me you wished to remain private, and I respected it, though it nearly killed me not to thank you." His voice cracked apart. "And when I finally find you, when God finally puts you in front of me, it's because my own city threw you in a cage." Elijah's own eyes were wet now. "Sir," he said softly, "I thought about that boy every day. I never knew if he made it home. You just gave me something I've needed for 11 years. A tear slid down into his gray stubble. You told me he lived. That's worth more to me than any medal ever was. And then Robert Hale, Superior Court Judge, 30 years on the bench, reached out and pulled the homeless man into an embrace and held on and wept openly into his shoulder. The courtroom rose. Every single person. They rose to their feet in a thunder of sound applause and cheering and weeping all at once. Hank Mosley snapped to attention and held a trembling salute. Frank Delgado cried without shame. Reporters forgot to take notes. The room that had been called to Judge Elijah Carter rose to honor him instead. Outside the courthouse, the clip of that embrace, the judge stepping down from his bench to hold the man his city had called trash, would hit the internet within the hour and travel around the world by nightfall. The same phones that had captured Elijah's humiliation now captured his vindication. But the moment that broke the room came 20 minutes later. While the paperwork was still being processed, the courtroom doors opened, and a man in his mid-30s walked in, breathing hard, having driven 90 miles an hour the moment his father called him. He had a slight, permanent limp. He stopped at the back of the room and looked at the gray-haired man standing near the bench, and his face crumpled like a child's. "Doc," Daniel Hale said, his voice barely working. "Doc." Elijah turned, and the calm he'd worn through everything, the arrest, the cell, the courtroom, finally gave way completely. "Lieutenant," he whispered. Daniel crossed the room in long, uneven strides and threw his arms around the man who had carried him out of the fire. "You kept telling me to talk about my mom's garden." He sobbed into Elijah's shoulder. "You wouldn't let me close my eyes. You said, stay with me, soldier. You wouldn't let me go." "I know, son." Elijah held the back of his head with one big, steady hand, the way he had 11 years ago in the smoke. "I know. You stayed with me. You stayed." And the whole room wept, because some debts can never be repaid, they can only finally be seen. The story did not end in that courtroom. In a way, it finally began there. By the next morning, the footage of a judge stepping down from his bench to embrace a homeless veteran had been seen by tens of millions. The 11-second clip that had once shown Elijah's humiliation was now paired everywhere with its sequel, the salute, the reunion, the truth. The headline that ran across the country said it plainly: they called him trash. He wore the Medal of Honor. Officer Brad Keller was formally terminated within the week. The district attorney's office charged him with filing a false report, perjury, and violating Elijah's civil rights under color of law. The 3 old complaints that had been quietly buried over the years were reopened. Keller, who had been so sure the system would always protect its own, learned that a system can also, when forced to look in a mirror, turn. But Elijah Carter never spent 1 minute gloating over it. When a reporter asked him outside the courthouse whether he wanted to see Keller punished, he thought for a long moment. "I want him to learn," Elijah said finally. "Punishment without learning is just more pain in the world, and I've seen enough pain. I'd rather he become a man who'd never do it again than a man who just got caught." The change in his own life came fast and from every direction. Daniel Hale would not hear of Elijah spending another night under a bridge. Within days, a small house on a quiet street near the river was arranged, and when Elijah tried to refuse it, Daniel just shook his head and said, "Doc, you carried me 40 meters through fire. Let me carry you across a doorway. Please." Elijah, who had never in his life known how to accept help, finally learned how. And the first thing he did in that house was open the back door so Scout could run in circles in a real yard, barking with a joy that made grown men laugh. The Department of Veterans Affairs, suddenly and intensely interested, untangled 11 years of lost paperwork in 9 days. The back benefits he was owed came through a sum large enough to change everything. Elijah looked at the number for a long time. Then he kept enough to live simply, and he asked Judge Hale and Daniel to help him do something with the rest. Together they founded the Bull Street Fund, named deliberately for the place where a man had been called trash, providing housing, mental health care, and legal advocacy for homeless veterans across Georgia. Hank Mosley signed on the first day. Frank Delgado donated breakfast every Sunday, served at long tables in a converted warehouse, where no one washed dishes for their food unless they wanted to. Rachel Quinn, the overworked public defender, who had refused to let her client take an easy plea, left her caseload to run the fund's legal arm full-time. "No, you believed me," Elijah told her once, "before you had any reason to. That's the whole thing, isn't it? Believing a man's worth before he proves it to you." The city of Savannah issued a formal apology. The police department overhauled its training around homelessness and de-escalation, and named the new program after Elijah, though he asked that it carry the names of the 4 men in the striker instead, so that nobody would forget that he was only one of many and that the others mattered just as much. But the moment that stayed with everyone who knew the story came on a cold morning the following winter. Elijah Carter, clean-shaven in a warm coat that fit, looking 10 years younger than the man Keller had dragged across the concrete, walked beneath the Truman Parkway overpass where he had once slept. Daniel walked beside him. Scout trotted ahead, sniffing the old familiar ground. In the gray light against a concrete pillar, a young man sat huddled under a thin blanket, another veteran. By the dog tags around his neck, another man the world had decided to stop seeing. Elijah crouched down in front of him, the way someone had once needed to crouch down for him. "Morning," he said gently. "Cold one. You eat today?" The young man shook his head, wary, braced for the cruelty he'd learned to expect. Elijah unfolded a heavy wool blanket and draped it around the young man's shoulders. Then he pressed a warm paper bag of breakfast into his hands and a card with an address on it. "There's a place on Williard Street. Hot food, a bed, people who will help you fight the VA and win. You tell them Doc sent you. You hear me?" The young man stared at him. This stranger kneeling in the cold, treating him like he was somebody. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Elijah smiled, the same calm, steady smile he'd worn through the worst of it, and rested a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Because somebody finally did it for me," he said. "And a man's worth was never about what he's wearing, or where he sleeps, or the color of his skin." He stood, and Scout pressed against his leg, and Daniel waited beside him in the gray morning light. "It's about whether somebody bothers to see you. Somebody saw me. Now I see you. That's how it's supposed to go." And he walked on down the line of pillars where 2 more men were waking in the cold, carrying his bag of warm food and his stack of cards, passing forward. A thing that could never be repaid only continued.
A man's dignity was never stitched into his clothes or printed on his bank statement. It lives in who he is when the world looks away, and in whether we bother to truly see the people we've been taught to overlook. Sometimes the person we call worthless is carrying a star we never thought to look for. If this story moved, you tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And who is someone in your life the world overlooked, but you chose to see? Hit subscribe and stay, because every soul has a story worth honoring.